we discover our values because of some good feeling in our brain ultimately. But I don't think that has to correspond to all feelings. I think there are many times when we choose and we feel good about the choice to do something that won't feel as good in some way because it aligns with our values. And it will feel good in a different way, but it's not necessarily the anxiety or lack thereof dimension. We could even make this very tangible. I think values probably correspond much more closely to serotonin systems than, say, cortisol. This year has been a great example. I've probably got pretty high serotonin. I'm living according to my values, but it's been stressful. I have had probably higher cortisol than the last few years. And those don't necessarily have to be tied together all the time. I don't think values just mean whatever is most conducive to happiness. Welcome to the Mindform Podcast, where we delve into the minds of some of the most interesting people on the planet, discuss psychology, philosophy, and personal growth, and share the wisdom we uncover with you. Join us as we explore the art of forming our minds. Here's your host, Frank Lawton.
Kia ora from New Zealand. Welcome to the Mindform Podcast. Here we share real conversations with earnest seekers of the good life, uncovering gems of wisdom every time. Each guest is a unique expert in philosophy, psychology, and personal growth, and all are members of the Psychitecture collective and training platform Mindform. This week I'm speaking yet again with Mindform's creator, Ryan Bush. Always a pleasure. Love chatting to this guy. We want to talk this week a bit about approaches to growth. Is growth subtractive? You're peeling back the layers to reveal your true self, or is it additive? You're building on virtues and skills. Yeah, it's a theme that comes up a bit in Mindform as we have a diversity of people pursuing growth. So yeah, I figured this episode will each bring up our understandings of how that works and see how we butt against each other. But for starters, what's alive in you, Ryan?
Hey, Frank. Happy to be back. What's alive in me right now is just excitement about a bunch of cool projects coming together. Show you right here. I've got a prototype deck for a card game. It's this in itself is nothing special. This is just blank cards essentially. But what's exciting is I have figured out everything that goes on those cards, and so we're going to be play testing a board game this week that will hopefully be launching before too long. So you'll be able to play Psychitecture with your friends.
Yeah. And I'm assuming my impression is you're bringing a set of that along to the Mindform retreat in January, yeah?
So yeah, my hope is both to be able to play test over Zoom with people at some point, and that we'll be able to play in person in New Zealand, and maybe even have more polished, not just scribbled on cards, but like real graphics and stuff, and more refined kind of game balancing. So that's going to be very exciting.
It's all about the playtest. It's all about the playtest, isn't it? I mean, that's the only way you find out how fun it is. So
yeah,
exciting. Awesome. Well, how about we start with I'll go first, and just to kind of lay the ground a bit, but with our views of growth. So my growth journey started with it was kind of and this isn't uncommon for young men as well, kind of grounded on insecurity a little bit. I wanted to be somebody, but it was also a natural desire to take some control over my life. I was dissatisfied, and it was really, a lot of it was informed by and built from watching other people and kind of wanting to be like those other people who are telling you, your morning routine, do this, and kind of, trying to mold myself into this image of a capable, better guy. And a lot of that for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people who are early maybe in a journey of exploring growth, a lot of it was disconnected from myself. It was just trying to be somebody. And that's been a long evolving journey for me, but I'm kind of at this place at the moment where I'm trying to reconcile these two approaches to growth, the additive and the subtractive. So I've discovered that as much as developing good habits, good thinking processes, positive thoughts, kind of, yes, grinding, motivating, whatever myself out of some of these issues. As much as that helps, something else helps in a completely different way, and in a way that often feels more effortless, which is getting connected to myself, getting in touch with myself, listening to my feelings, and really working on that process of figuring out what are the things that I care about that I don't need to care about that are getting in the way, or what of these different motivations that I have are motivated by fear or have something to do with kind of a problematic pursuit that I developed due to traumatic experiences, and what of it is out of, I don't know, maybe for want of a less loaded term, but like out of love, or maybe out of curiosity or joy or play. And I find that the more I lean into what feels like play for me, what feels like joy, what feels like curiosity, at the very base of my growth journey, like the more I just try to base all of it in that, the less likely I am to get burned out by the effort, for one. And yeah, just, I don't know. I'm just kind of leaning that way. It's a new kind of experience. It's opening new doors. I'll start with that. Maybe you can present, because I know you've articulated it very well in your time with your books and that, your kind of view of growth and how one pursues growth and what it is.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say, I'm not entirely sure that this sort of distinction between the additive good habits and the subtractive sort of self reflection and removal of layers are necessarily two different things, right? I'll just say that, or that either one of them conflicts with my vision of growth. I think to fully lay it out, it may be helpful to sort of go back to the beginning and ask what is default human nature in the first place, because that's kind of implicit in a lot of these discussions. It's like, oh, if we're perfect by default naturally and we get corrupted by insecurity, ego, modern society, whatever it is, then that paints a very different picture than if we're the opposite. We're super messed up by default, and we have to sort of ascend to something greater than nature. And so my view on all this is that human nature is shaped by natural selection for ultimately reproductive purposes. And so we evolved in the world of our ancestors, and we basically acquired a mixed bag of traits and desires and motivations and all these things from that ancestral environment and what was adaptive there. And so that means, well, one, that's how we got our values in my mind. So it's how we decide what's good and what's bad in human nature. And my sort of understanding is that, yeah, we've by default, we've got a mix of things that we ourselves evaluate as good and bad. So if you look at our ancestors' world, I think if we go back to tribal sort of hunter-gatherer times, you'll find a lot of problems, a lot of things that we don't like there about the human condition, whether it's the actual conditions, predation and parasites and all this, or the human dispositions that we don't like, that don't align with our values. It's just the suffering, the cruelty that is a part of this world, right? There's a lot not to like about that world. But then you switch over to the modern world. There's a lot that works better in the ancient world, I think. So we live in a world today where, yeah, we've kind of traded predation and parasites for addiction and depression and obesity and all these modern inventions, right? And so I think when it comes to human nature, that creates a different set of traits, right? It conditions us into a different
Right.
set of problems and virtues potentially, right? Skills. And my view in general is that we more or less stayed the same in terms of how good people are and how good conditions are. We've traded a few things, but ultimately humans have always had this mixed bag of traits. And this is where I think psychitecture comes in, because unlike every other species, humans aren't just subject to the evolutionary forces that have shaped us. We have the mental capacities, the metacognition, the creativity, the ability to become our own designers. And I think in that sense, psychitecture, this design process of ourselves, can be both additive and subtractive. It's a matter of applying our values to our actual mind, our actual character, our actual emotions, and saying, what do I like about this? What do I like in other people? How can I build those habits? And then also, what do I not like? And then how do I get rid of
Mm,
that? I think in some cases, the way that you change these mental habits is this sort of analytical, I need to develop a new skill.
yeah,
And it's very cognitive. I think in other cases, it very well may be a matter of pure awareness or somatic practices or just getting in touch with your actual nature. Um, and, and I think both sort of awareness and cognitive change and behavioral change, all of these are potential leverage points for changing the things that you don't
yeah.
like about yourself, that don't align with your values. And ultimately, if we look at any habit in our mind, the process of replacing that with something better is it's both additive and subtractive. It's both focused on the problem, which is the existing habit, and the solution, which is the better one that will cause us to align more closely with our ideals. Psychitecture deals with these mental habits and replacing less optimal ones with more optimal ones. And so that in general kind of captures the goal of growth, right? What we're actually doing,
Mm,
moving from where we're starting to where we want to be.
yeah. Okay. I've got a lot. A lot of has come up for me as you've describe that. I mean, one, I agree that it's additive and subtractive, but what that makes me think is that this kind of distinction I was trying to articulate when I spoke, that those terms, additive versus subtractive, don't really map
Right.
onto the distinction I was trying to draw. I think what I sense is that there's sort of two phases. You talk about applying our values. One thing I wanted to say, you're saying, is our nature good or not? And some people think it is good, some people think it isn't good, some people have a view more rationally in the middle. But my understanding is, despite having traits, desires, motives, vulnerabilities that don't align with our values, what we don't have are values that don't align with our values, almost as a truism, right? Like, what is good is what we think is good. And so just kind of that, when I look at it from that perspective, I see us as innately good because we innately want the good. Because what we want, when we're in touch with that, is the good, kind of by definition. Some people would you and I certainly would kind of say that that is where the good comes from. It's just the things that we kind of most deeply value. That's all that means. And so, people say, well, what I've said to myself is, people in truth want the good, because at all sorts of different times and moments we want things that are and pursue things that are against our values. But I think when we are, I suppose, it's that awareness side, when we're in touch with ourselves, when we're listening to ourselves and kind of accessing the whole picture of what's going on inside us and what it is that we value, then what we value is what's good. And so that's kind of, in a sense, that's the truer version of ourselves, because it's it's there across time, and at I suppose a deeper level, or a broader level through our psyche. And sort of that made me think that there's these two phases or approaches to the applying our values, which can totally be additive or subtractive. Are we trying to develop some new communication skill, or some virtue of discipline or whatever? Are we, yeah, trying to escape a cycle of fear that came on us out of our own control when we were younger, whatever it is? I think there's the first stage, which is kind of right brain, so to speak, right? Which is finding out what it is that you value, getting in touch with that. Where does that pursuit come from? Where does the goal of who I want to be come from? I think that's a really important part of the process, because if you're pursuing goals that kind of you've just adopted intellectually without that self curiosity, it might not be the case that those are really your goals. And then there's another phase, which is the actually solving the problem or pursuing the goal phase. And I think that has a right brain, left brain distinction as well. Are you kind of comparing yourself to an outcome and making shifts and adjustments? That's more left brain. The right brain side of that is kind of getting to understand through awareness, through curiosity, through sensitivity, well, what are the workings? What are the mechanisms underlying and part of this issue that I have? Because through understanding it more, I'm going to maybe I'll shift my understanding of what the goal is, but I'll certainly get more information so I can pursue that goal. So that's kind of, I think, my concern that I have, and which is why I'm moving. I'm having this movement in my life and my approach to growth is that for those of us, which might not be all people, but certainly has been me, for those of us who are maybe a bit disconnected from ourselves and who aren't in touch with what it is I value or don't have the skills of self listening, whatever it is, without an intentional focus on that right brain side of it. Okay, what is it that I actually value and want to become? How do I find that out? By listening to myself. What is it that actually works for me to create change? What is the reason I'm behaving the way I don't want to behave? Well, let me listen to myself and find out. I think if you skip that, there's a lot can go wrong because you're basing your pursuit on flawed or incomplete information, and it might not be a pursuit that every part of you wants to engage in the first place. So that's kind of the shift I think that I'm making, and I'm curious to take on that because my perception, at least, of Mindform and your work is that it's much more focused on the you know, here's the outcome and these are the strategies we have to achieve that outcome, and that's a necessary part of the process because if you're just listening to yourself and feeling yourself, but you're not doing anything about it, you're not going to get anywhere, perhaps.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. So first, as you kind of know from DTM and become who you are, the sort of core of all of my work is this thing we call values, or value intuitions, ideals. And a core focus of that is how do you actually know? How do you get in touch with
Mm,
these things? And I provide sort of ways of doing that. I think, to me, when I think about the types of communities that are focused on just the latter, just the goals and optimizations, you'll find like a community centered around like getting rich or like
yeah.
these things that people think they want until they achieve it, and then they realize, oh, that wasn't actually me. I'm still unhappy. I'm not aligned with my values, right? And so to me, at the very least, I think Mindform and my work takes leaps in the direction of this is actually the types of goals, these are the types of improvements that are genuinely likely to make a person much more
Mm,
fulfilled than the ones you probably want more by default. So I'll first say that. Second, yeah, I mean, in Become Who You Are, it sounds like the same thing you're kind of saying because you're talking about these values and yeah, these values sort of being a truer version of us than we are in our reality, and that's very much the Become Who You Are. There's sort of two yous in there implied. There's
yeah.
the current you in your actions and habits as you are now, and then there's the you of your values, which is who you are, and so. I think we're largely aligned on that. I think one area where you may sort of poke holes is ultimately like we do create sort of value conceptualizations. We do sort of talk about, well, start out with this sort of anthropomorphized, personified ideal self, and then derive from that a finite set of values, which are conceptual and you could say left brained. And so I could see arguing no, we should have this much more holistic, intuitive way of connecting with our ideal self and finding out who we should be. And we shouldn't try to split it up into these distinct concepts. So that's one interesting angle. But I'll stop on that part there. And I want to talk about the human nature part as well, because it sounds like what you're saying is you think that in spite of some of these negative habits, these dispositions that don't align with our ideals, people are good simply because people have good values, because values are fundamentally defined by what we view as good. And so that makes sense. By that definition, I would certainly say we're good as well. I guess one challenge or question I would throw out there is if we discovered an alien species on another planet who had very different values, let's say that they value the suffering of others and they truly like that looks like a better world, that looks like a better self to them. That's what they admire is people who create just mass suffering at unimaginable scales. would we say they are also good through the lens of their values? Would we say they're bad through the lens of our values? And does this ultimately mean that we're ultimately just talking about subjectivity here? This is just different people's preferences or tastes in these matters.
Well, I got kind of two answers to that. My first is a bit kind of to scoff and say, oh, who cares, because we haven't encountered such a thing, and if we did, I think some of us may be concerned with the philosophical implications of it, but I think we'd mainly just be concerned with living out our values in that context and trying to survive. So, kind of pish posh, I'm talking about humans, but not theoretical aliens. But I'm not against a thought experiment. My response to it as a thought experiment is actually that not only do I think, as far as we yet know, such a thing doesn't exist, so none of our business, I also think that such a thing in principle couldn't exist. And I think that, I don't know if that's a difference between you and me, but I'll sort of flesh out my argument for that. I think that there are truisms about being goal-seeking organisms. If we were to conceive of something as alien life, I think it would have to tick that box of there being kind of consciousness and there being goal-seeking behavior. So if I think having those two things in the material world, I think the values that we've kind of come up with that have been helpful for us to survive, I think they've been helpful for us to survive, and we can work with them to experience lasting joy because of truisms about, or it's not truisms, true facts about the way consciousness and goal-seeking behavior works in the material world as it is. Let me see if I can kind of elucidate a couple of those facts that lead me to that conclusion. So, for example, if there are different various organisms, they don't have to be different, but if there's multiple organisms, I think seeking the well-being or the goal support, and that's kind of collaboration, I suppose, or seeking collaboration with other organisms is always inherently functional. I don't see, I think kind of there's these two states that reality can be in, sort of harmony versus disharmony and conflict, and I see it as always maladaptive to be in the conflict state, simply because you're surrounded by more risks. If you can take the truths about the world around you, and that includes the values, desires, etc., of other organisms, and find a way to align your goals with that, work with that, incorporate that into your pursuits, then that's going to work well in your favor, because clashing pursuits inherently are going to undermine each other, and you can't promise to win that out. And we sort of talked about this before the call, Ryan, that in times of scarcity, people made kind of these more harmful to, in our mind, in our view as human beings, values will come to the surface a bit. Competition, dominance, authoritarianism, violence come to the surface a bit because people aren't seeking this long-term, deeper, ultimate kind of sense of flourishing. They just want to survive to the next day. And I think at that short-term level, totally is functional to pursue or not even pursue conflict, but assume conflict and try to succeed at it. But I think that's inherently going to be more short-term beneficial than collaboration. So the values that looks like is empathy, because then you're able to understand others' views; compassion, then you're able to sort of create a state of reciprocity, etc., and you'll be able to be included in participation. So I think these kind of compassionate, love, etc. type values are actually truisms for there being multiple agents, conscious agents. I'll leave it at that and see what you have to say.
Yeah, cool. So I guess the first thing I'd say is, in terms of the initial sort of who cares reaction, I think we could definitely bring it home much more. I mean, we can at least imagine human psychopaths who have these fundamentally alien values. I don't actually think that's how psychopathy works. I think we're lucky in that sense, but it's not that hard to imagine. We did live in a world where these very different values exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would add to that and say my view is that each human has slightly different values, or at least priorities among those values. And so
Yeah.
we
I
do
agree.
have to sort of locate the arbiter of, good here. Is everyone just good according to their own values, and that makes them good? Well, okay, if everyone's values just have to align with their own values for them to be good, then there's certainly no arguing that everyone's good. Again, we can imagine a being who we would very much not look at and say that person is good, at least through our value lens. So, but it's interesting. You feel like those aliens potentially couldn't exist, that goal-seeking organisms fundamentally need to be sort of coordinated and capable of
Well, I wouldn't
empathy
say
and compassion.
necessarily that they need to be. I would just say it's more. It just serves. It's going to serve whatever interests they have. It's going to serve them more. They're not going to develop an innate interest and a preset interest in other people suffering for its own sake. There's no really
Mhm.
evolutionary context where that's going to help their continued existence. And I don't think there's kind of a phenomenal context where it's going to create situations of less anxiety or whatever, or less negative conscious experience. So yeah, I just don't think that could exist kind of for that reason.
Yeah, well, so I agree. It's sort of hard to imagine the evolutionary dynamics that would produce something like that, but it's also hard to imagine the evolutionary dynamics that have produced us. Like it took it took thousands of years for us to figure that out. So I wouldn't put it past some kind of cosmic Darwinian system that very different conditions in another part of the world could produce this kind of mind. You can yeah, and I think another just tagging on to that is like,
Mm.
maybe it does produce more anxiety. Like maybe these organisms aren't necessarily very happy, but they're living according to their values, which maybe is more important than just being free from anxiety, you could argue. For them, that's good.
Nah, you couldn't. Nah, I don't think you could argue that. I don't think you could argue that because that our value structures, I think, are elucidated to us by the dynamics of our positive and negative experience. I think we know what our values are because we discover that when we encounter them or live them out, that we experience this positive kind of phenomenal state of resonance or joy or satisfaction or pride or whatever it is, depending on how we encounter our values. I think that's how we know, how we discover what our values are.
Okay, so I agree that we discover our values because of some good feeling in our brain ultimately, but I don't think that has to correspond to all feelings. I don't think values just mean whatever is most conducive to happiness. I think there are many times when we choose and we feel good about the choice to do something that won't feel as good in some way because it aligns with our values. And it will feel good in a different way, but it's not necessarily the anxiety or lack thereof dimension. There are many. We could even make this very tangible. Like I think
Yeah,
values probably correspond much more closely to serotonin systems than say cortisol. And I think uh,
definitely.
this year has been a great example. I'm probably got pretty high serotonin. I'm living according to my values, but it's been stressful. I have had probably higher cortisol than the last few years, and those don't necessarily have to be tied together all the time. I think, yeah, this alien world where yeah, maybe it is this sort of kind of barbaric mess, right? Or maybe it's not. Maybe these aliens are capable of coordinating efforts perfectly intelligently, but they're sort of strategizing in the same way that we strategize. Imagine the opposite of effective altruism, where these groups are coming together and saying, okay, how can we like really strategically plan mass suffering? Maybe we don't even mess with our own planet because that's going to cause us a whole headache. Maybe we focus on other beings in other parts of the universe. You're
Nah,
not buying it.
nah, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced because then I guess the question is, how did they get to that state? I can imagine. Okay, here's what I could imagine for a moment, and then I thought, nah, is yeah, a kind of a type of being, whatever, or collection of beings that are so incredibly capable and guaranteed to be, and have been throughout their entire evolutionary history in order to develop these traits, but deeply built into them as their values, they've always just been way more capable and better at everything than every other kind of organism around them. And so, it does always work out in their favor to dominate. I couldn't see it as working out in their favor to pursue the suffering of other organisms, because that doesn't, I don't think there's any context where that's kind of going to have the strongest correlate to their benefit. But pursuing destruction of other organisms so they can take their resources or control, that I can see happening. But I just think that, every organisms by definition kind of have a history of development, and they become what they are by surviving, and they adapt by surviving through and adapting through kind of, I guess, a shifting environment, or maybe even a static environment, but an environment over time. I think because of that, and because of the fact that some of their skills wouldn't have been there once, they're going to have to develop them. Every organism's going to encounter situations that have this structure, which I think is kind of true ultimately, which is that working with what is around you is going to benefit you more than trying to contort and destroy it ultimately. We have both, right? We have both value structures in us. We have the value structure of dominating, controlling, and destroying, and we have the value structure of collaborating, basically, and seeking to understand. And so they both exist, they both function, but ultimately when you're in that collaborative state, you're encountering less threats and you're perceiving less as threats. And I think every organism, in order to exist as an organism with capacities, you're going to have to go through encountering both of those environments in your evolutionary history. And so you would, and even if you didn't, which you would, but even if you didn't, there is just inherently less that is a threat to you when you are engaging with the world as your ally and not your competition, whether that's other organisms or whether it's the environment itself that you're engaging with. There is less that is going to concern you. And so even if we're kind of stepping out of the conversation of like, oh, what values become innate? What are the innate sort of evolutionarily created values? You can step back and say, well, also, what mode of behaving is going to produce more psychological well-being? And I think, like, at the broader, deeper, longer-term level, and again, I think that's going to be collaboration. Like you said, no, maybe it's not about anxiety. Well, yeah, I agree. Anxiety is the wrong choice of words. I think it's about kind of the sum, the net overall, throughout the different layers and across time, the overall existence of positive emotion, the level of positive emotion, whatever, within an agent. And for you, you talk about, oh, I've had a stressful year, I've had a lot of cortisol, but my serotonin's really high. Well, I do understand serotonin as being sort of, oh, do I feel capable, and do I kind of approve of myself? Am I winning at life? Whatever. So that kind of lines a little bit more with, okay, virtue, it is kind of about matching up with virtues. But I think also, if you're happy, if you're doing well, if you're choosing to live like this and you're glad about it, even though you're anxious, that's because you prefer whatever positive emotions you're getting out of aligning with your values, plus the experience of anxiety. You prefer that overall to the not that experience of anxiety, but also missing out on the feelings that you get when you live out these values. So I think it's a net positive experience for you. If it wasn't more positive experience for you, you wouldn't be choosing it. So it is about positive experience.
Okay. So
that was a lot. Sorry, that was like a big word.
No. It's good stuff.
You couldn't. Okay.
So I've had this similar kind of debate with an old friend of mine. It's like, he says, I don't think that the sort of doomsday scenario where we're visited by this alien species who destroys us is plausible, because I think in order to achieve that kind of level of coordination to even be able to travel to another part of the universe, they would need to have advanced on a wisdom and coordination and empathy level enough to not want to be so destructive, right? And
I agree.
I always have a number of questions to that. So it's like, first of all, is that exactly what led us to this level of advancement, to Western capitalism, Silicon Valley? Is that what led us to go to the moon? was that we've just been getting so compassionate and empathetic and pro-social that we've, you know, it's enabled greater levels of coordination? Or is it just that there's some arbitrary barrier beyond where we are now that suddenly is going to start requiring this level of wisdom? Because in my mind, humans haven't really improved in wisdom, despite all of our improvements in knowledge and technology. In my mind, we're kind of
I
still
agree.
just as foolish as we were. So, are we really going to say that we can't achieve super advanced levels of capability without wisdom when clearly, by many measures, we already have? Um,
It's a
another
good critique.
another point here is like, I don't think the unlikeliness of this extreme alien example is a threat to the philosophical point. Like, yeah, maybe it is really unlikely that
I think it
Darwinian.
is, but go ahead. Sorry.
Well, let's think about it like this. You know, maybe we're not talking about a being who actively values the suffering of other beings. Maybe we're just talking about a being who doesn't have any values that clash with the suffering of others. Like I don't think
Mm,
organisms need to have values
AI.
at all. I think that humans are potentially unique in having emerged these things called values in the first place. Like if we look at other animals, I'm not sure
Mm,
that they have these values at all, and certainly they don't live according to them if they do, right? You can find some really brutal stuff, very capable animals who are perfectly fine with eating other animals alive and
wasps.
tapping into their nervous systems and controlling them. So I'm not convinced that organisms must inherently have pro-social values or values at all, or that they necessarily have to increase in their pro-sociality or wisdom in order to increase in capability. I think it's maybe even kind of anthropocentric to suggest that like humans being the pro-social animals and the most intelligent, like we are in the special category and that those things have to go together. Yeah, I think that mostly covers my thoughts on that.
All right, all right. I can challenge each of those points. I
Okay.
think saying that it's unlikely is relevant because the point that I'm making with that is to say, no, we live in the kind of universe which means kind of the what we value as truism good. So it's actually a way of kind of claiming that our values have objective truth to them despite only existing in the subjective realm, because they're always going to, so if I say that if I say that conscious, intelligent, whatever organisms would always develop values like this because of the way the world works, then I'm actually saying that our values are true. They're sort of true claims about true descriptions of the way the world works. So that kind of the point is to say that there's an objectivity, and I think it makes that point. And then around animals, I mean, you're right. It's mortifying, and I actually had that thought ding up when I was talking before as an internal objection that, well, there are prolific, if we're thinking of succeeding at the goal of spreading their genes as well, there are prolific organisms that have no empathic concerns, no values, no anything. It's just destroy, 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 get, consume, 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 whatever. And and they're perfectly good at that. So I'll tell you what I can imagine is some kind of and I guess this does in some sense undermine my previous argument. I'll have to slightly change my argument. I can imagine some kind of interplanetary wasp, you know, that has no values that we can conceive of. Wasps or beings at that level of intelligence can certainly be collaborative. But I think to shift my argument slightly, I think these values are truisms for organisms that are capable of higher order reflective cognition and metacognition. So when you can analyze your behavior and consider the various subtleties of what kind of impacts it has in the short term and the long term, and make decisions about how's that going to work. And when that's the way that you do socialization, right? Like there's collaboration and socialization at many different levels of intelligence in the animal kingdom, but we do it through being engaged in a collective conversation at abstraction. And so I think when you have those cognitive capacities, you're then going to notice these patterns and shift your approach. If you're a wasp and you don't have that capacity, it doesn't these international wasps, whatever that we're imagining. They're not international, these interplanetary, intergalactic, multiversal, whatever. These horrible wasp aliens. They're a different kind of, they're not value having organisms. I think if you're a value having organism, you're gonna have these positive values. Yeah, I agree that it's possible to have capable, collectively acting organisms that don't have values or behave in a way that appears to be bad values we don't like. But I don't think there are values there. I think values are an abstraction. I think they come out of our capacity to look at the way we're behaving and notice what's going on and make decisions and choose this ultimate human thing that you're very passionate about, evolutionary rebellion, choose to seek psychological well-being, right, as opposed to just running through the evolutionary script that we have that's utilized the experience of psychological well-being to its advantage, programmed by our genes. I think now that once you become an organism that's making choices in that sense, then your values are going to be positive. That's my view. Positive as in our values.
Right. So this argument's inevitable at this point. Are you worried about the potential development of artificial intelligence that exceeds human intelligence on every level, AGI, ASI, artificial superintelligence? Or do you think that that level of intelligence must come with increasing levels of pro-social empathy, right? Human-like values.
Well, this is, I suppose, no, I am worried, and I think the difference is that, well, I guess this could count as the developmental context that I hadn't thought of. I suppose the difference is that AI is not something that's become what it is by existing and trying to survive in the world. It's designed, right? It exists in the sort of protective shell, and all of the goals it pursues are kind of preset, predetermined. It doesn't have, it appears to, through the way it does predictive language work, these language models, but it doesn't have metacognition. Maybe in theory it could, but it would be a completely different type of AI to what we have now, rather than just the same thing, but more iterative. Yeah, so yeah, I totally am concerned, and the reason I'm concerned is because we've created this unique context of intelligence without values, and so the question becomes, well, this tool, which of our values, the ones that are true for all of us, or the ones that come out of scarcity and lack of connection to self and other things like that, which of our values are we going to use to give this AI its jobs and its tasks? So yeah, no, I am concerned, but I think the type of thing AI is different to because it also doesn't have positive negative emotion. I think part of the map where I'm painting, our values are a truism, is for conscious experiences as well. Conscious experiences who kind of have come to be what they are through existing in the environment. So yeah, intelligences that aren't that could totally not have values and have sadistic values. I mean, surely that exists already. Someone's like some dude who's really, really unwell and really smart in a basement somewhere is like currently building an AI which is like just been given the prompt to do as much damage as possible. I mean, surely that's happening.
Yeah. No, I'm worried as well about that kind of thing. I I definitely think we're not just talking about a LLM here, that like what we have today. I think that it would require some very different technology. I don't see any reason to think that foundationally, like, no artificial system could be capable of the kind of metacognition that humans are, for example, or even that it's not kind of arbitrary to define it in terms of what humans are. I mean, to me, it's seeming like humans are very much the exception here, because we can talk about wasps or, intergalactic wasps. We can talk about AI. We could point to all these examples of beings that don't have human-like values. To me,
Yeah.
it's almost kind of miraculous that we do. And I think, I mean, that is kind of my view. It is miraculous that we got so lucky with our values, that we do tend to have these pro-social things, because it's not that hard, I
But
think,
what do
to
you mean? Well, you
imagine.
don't think it's lucky. No, you don't think it's lucky. Let me just challenge that, because whatever, because you see it as ultimately arbitrary. So you would think it's
Yeah.
lucky whatever values we had, because they would be the values that we have. It's not lucky that our values align with our values,
I think
right?
at the very least, if we just didn't have these values, that would be one less checkbox that we could say to, like, we wouldn't replace it with, "Oh, I'm so glad we um, just don't care." I mean, maybe that would be a benefit on that side,
Oh,
but
true. No, but I mean
yeah,
these
no,
specific values, not
it would
values at
be
all. Yeah,
arbitrary. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So that's true. I guess what I'm pointing to is, like, there are solitary organisms out there, and there are groupish organisms like bees and humans, right? I don't find it so hard to imagine, or necessarily even less likely than humanity, that there could emerge a being that's both solitary and has our level of intelligence. And in fact, even if AI has a different kind of thinking, we can at least imagine what that would be like because of AI. And so, to me, well, one, I still think even if it were unlikely but still possible in this universe, I think it would still point to a flaw in this argument. But I'm saying I don't even think it's unlikely. I think it's probably more likely than what we ended up with, that a solitary being that doesn't really care about other organisms would develop human level intelligence or greater.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're changing my mind just a little. I think when you say it's anthropomorphic, I think you're right. I think the way that it's anthropomorphic is my theorizings about, kind of these hypothetical organisms. There's a few things that I'm assuming, which then makes me say, oh, these would the values that we have would definitely be the values that would then happen. And I
Mhm.
think it's consciousness and the capacity to have positive and negative emotional valence. I think it's metacognition and abstract thought. I think it's coming to exist through a natural selection process in an environment. Maybe it would have to be a varied natural selection process. Yeah, I think maybe just that. So I think those things are unique to us. We're the only organisms that tick those boxes in the universe that we know of. So maybe I'm saying, maybe there's a lot of things that look like intelligence, look like collaboration, look like being goal oriented, that don't tick all of those boxes. I suppose I'm saying that if something ticked those boxes, then it would have our values, which is maybe to say not that these values are a truism in the universe, but to say that they're not just what we happen, they're not just true for us because they're what we happen to value. Oh, we value them, so it's true that we value them. I think I think facts about our nature outside of the fact that we value these things mean that these values are true for us. That would be my reduced claim.
Got it. Yeah.
You agree
Um,
with that?
I still probably wouldn't say I agree with that, because
Oh,
I I I think I understand. Yeah, I don't know. I did want to at least, we ventured pretty far from where we
I was
started in
gonna say,
terms
I
of
was gonna,
growth.
I was gonna interrupt you and say, let's like bring it back. Let's say,
Yeah,
let's take
yeah.
this very long-winded thought experiment and bring it back, because it really came out of me saying, just think that I think these values are true, and I'm not sure how that was relevant. It
Let
was
me
fun though.
look back at my notes. But so you think that human nature can be understood as good in spite of negative dispositions?
Yeah, that's where this all came from.
Hmm.
That was my argument for saying human nature is good, basically, and I stand by it. Let's re-enter that a little bit. Okay, so from that view, that human nature is good, I think that it's more important to, if we want to be good, to do good, to live out our values, I think it's more important that we practice curiosity, listening, sensitivity, empathy, and sort of these phenomenal experiences of self-discovery, I think that's like the most important part of the process, because it's kind of like I almost see misalignment with values as a gap, right? A gap between like a literal distance between, well, not literal, it's not material, but a distance between these various aspects of our thoughts and emotions and the way we behave to this nature, our values. And so we can do a lot of things at the level of thought, emotion, and behavior to try to create an alignment, but we can also just close the gap by bringing our awareness closer and closer more and more of the time to our values through self-listening, through self-discovery. And it, that could look like, I kind of made a little list here as we were talking, that can look like sort of mindfulness meditation. It can look like trauma work or body work. It can look like through frameworks like internal family systems. It can look like psychedelic drugs that sort of open up or break down these barriers of perception. But I suppose it's less of a outcome oriented, productive, creative process, and it's more of a discovery process where simply by bringing your thoughts and awareness to that, suddenly that's where your thoughts and awareness are, and you're living out of that spontaneously, naturally, organically, rather than kind of knowing about it and then having to put this effort in to try to create a match between it and your behavior. That's the difference between these two approaches to growth.
Yeah, I think I understand that, and it's pretty clear why the sort of alien psychopath experiment was pertinent and I think important to this. I guess the question I'm left with about this is, if our nature is good, not because of, but in spite of our dispositions. And if you would agree that even prior to modern society, hunter-gatherer world where all this left brain junk hasn't been imposed on top of us,
Yeah,
even in that world, there was still suffering, there was still cruelty, there
no
were
doubt,
still
no doubt.
things that don't align with our values, right? Then there's still work to be done to change us, not just back to some kind of default state before we became disconnected from it, but beyond, and to build new
Agreed,
habits that we weren't built for, right?
agreed.
And I think in terms of like which is most important, like just getting in touch and building awareness versus building new habits, not sure it's a particularly meaningful like difference. I don't know how you measure
To
which
pin them
one's
against
more
each
important.
other, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because ultimately, my understanding of how you work towards goals is you start with those values and getting in touch with them. And below that, you sort of build goals to sort of coordinate towards them, and then you organize your desires so as to fuel you in the direction of the goals which are aligned with the values. So it's all one integrated process. I wouldn't want to do without either the intuitive part that determines the end or the more rational part that determines the means. You need both of those. And so it yeah, to me it seems like we're mostly aligned at the end of the day on how we should go about growing. Or are you still not? No.
Nah. No, I think that more goes on with the getting in touch with yourself than just developing a sort of an appropriate, accurate concept of what your values are or what your
Mhm.
outcomes are. To bring up your, oh, do we want to return to an old state? No, no, absolutely not. I mean, you know, to kind of use the spiritual allegory or whatever, I'm not trying to return to pre-fall, where we didn't have knowledge of good and evil. That's
Yeah.
the idea, and that sort of map exists in different religious histories as well, where it's kind of like there was this innocence, and then we kind of developed these intellectual capacities, metacognition, and blah, blah, and then evil came. Well, I think, yeah, in some sense, sure, right? There's a new layer to our suffering when we're dissatisfied with our own behavior, and we're able to sort of, and I suppose also the fact that we have this knowledge and this responsibility and this awareness of what good is and how to be good and then don't do it is kind of worse than just, like a 3-year-old who's acting up, who doesn't really know yet why that's harmful to other people or whatever. So, I can see that why people see that as a sort of a moral downgrade or something in some way. But I don't think returning to a sort of a lack of awareness in this place of just pure spontaneity is the goal. But I think you think of going back in human history, right? Pre the sort of extreme levels and dominating levels of abstraction and left brainisms that we have now, predating that, where people were just kind of living out what they felt. That doesn't mean that they were getting in touch with the full layers and depths of themselves, because whilst I see that as a right brain process, doing left brain process or primarily operating in that right brain responsive way doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing that act of self-discovery, right? I think you need space, you need solitude, you need metacognition, you need reflective capacities, and these are things that you can teach yourself or that you can be taught. But I think you need to bring those abilities to an intentional space of discovery and empathy and curiosity, and that's what was missing then. Not what was missing then wasn't the absence of goal oriented abstraction. And I mean, people have always, I think, at all times have been living out harmful impulses and playing out traumas. Just kind of just because you like having a trauma happens, right brain, left brain, whatever. It's there. It's in your behavior. You need some way to step out of that and engage with it. I guess what I'm saying is I see it as fundamentally important to interact with misaligned behavior through like a curiosity, discovery based, right brain process, sensitivity based is probably the way that I would put it, and non-goal oriented. I think that's really fundamental. And if we bring it back to now, okay, so we're not going pre-fall, what's this new place I want us to go to? What is it that I see as growth? I think that people like, I agree with, Ian McGilchrist's diagnosis that we are sort of too left brain or whatever as a collective, and that kind of means we're out of touch with ourselves and disconnected from our environment and all of that. So one thing I would say is, let's get more sensitive, let's get in touch with ourselves, let's operate from a place of curiosity without goals more. But I'll give an example from my own life to kind of paint the picture of growth. So when I practice mindfulness, what happens there is, well, I was just kind of noting this the other day. So I've been going on a lot of walks recently, and it's really nice for me. And I was kind of noting that, well, what's really the power of a walk is that you've kind of achieved your outcome once your feet are hitting the ground and the trees are slowly going past you and stuff. There's no outcome. You're just kind of seeing what you're thinking about and what comes up for you and whatever, and you're just exploring it. And I practice also a lot of like mindfulness meditation and that as well. So that becomes a strong space of mindfulness for me. And what I sort of noticed is that thinking doesn't really get me very far most of the time. Like most thoughts that I have, and this is just the monkey mind or whatever, most thoughts that I have, I could just not have and I'll sort of be fine without them. And I could just kind of return to feeling what I'm feeling and seeing what I'm seeing and hearing what I'm hearing and having my attention on that. And what comes out of that process for me is not just kind of a new idea that I can then pursue my goals with. It's a complete shift in my state where there's a part of me that I'm now in touch with. And that's not like a separate kind of in touch with where, oh, I see it, I'm aware of it, and I can make decisions on that. It integrates into me, and then I'm able to spontaneously act that out. And a broader selection of my intentions and values are then organically expressed. And it's through intentional self-awareness that's happened. But that's all I've done. That the awareness process is all I've done. I haven't sort of done anything else beyond that. And for me personally, the more that I do that type of work to discover and align with my values, just getting in touch and then letting the rest kind of happen, the better for me. Personally, I notice that I spontaneously act in alignment with my values more often, because to me, our behavior, where our behavior at any given moment comes from, it comes from the whole state, right, of your inner self. Like what different parts of you are active, what different anxieties are you bringing, what's your thoughts and focus, what are you thinking about and focusing on in this context, what's your state of arousal, stress, fear, curiosity, whatever, right? It comes out of whatever state is there in that moment. And I find that through getting in touch with myself and discovering my values, then through each moment, there's kind of lower levels of fear, more higher levels of curiosity, and sort of more of my deeper values are at the surface. And then that's just what spontaneously comes out without effort. Whereas when I take this thinking approach, this effortful approach, I'm fighting this battle because I still have all of this disconnection and these these broken parts that are vying for an action in response to my environment, that are sort of all throwing in their bid, right, to see what comes out, what I do. Sometimes I win that battle choosing my values, and maybe I'm just not good enough at that, and I could develop more skill at that. But it's quite effortful, because that conscious thinking process is only a very, very small part of what's alive in me when I ending up behaving. So I get further by shifting that whole framework of what's alive in me, by changing how I relate to myself. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Although it's still leading me to think we are not that far apart and more different in proportion and scale maybe than like fundamental content.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like you'll have to admit that what you are talking about is still psychitecture. These
No doubt.
tools are still psychotechnologies, and they're ultimately
I agree.
still goal
Yeah, I love
oriented.
psychotecture. Sorry.
Yeah, no, they're ultimately still goal oriented, and that obviously, if you were practicing these things and finding, "Oh, this actually makes me a worse person, I feel worse, I act less the way I want to act," well, you wouldn't be doing them anymore. So there's a goal, but you are sort of more interested and have had more success with these sort of bulk operator type psychotechnologies that aren't necessarily so targeted and thinking in left brain. They're more, you do this one big thing and it automatically solves a lot of problems. And for me to argue with that, I'd also have to argue with the idea that like sleep is really important or something. Like, it would be absurd to say, oh no, you don't need to sleep as long as you are practicing psychitecture. Your whole brain will fall apart if you don't sleep. So that's why I call a lot of these things, including like metacognitive awareness, mindfulness, as prerequisites to psychitecture and to these more cognitive practices. And so in that sense that they're prerequisite, I think I have to agree they are more important. You can be okay without one and not the other. I do have to say, I guess I see these cognitive behavioral approaches as maybe more advanced, and still, like, I don't think just mindfulness by itself or just like right brain connection with self solves everything. I mean, I have been
Mm.
at times in my life very fulfilled and in touch with myself, and I think many would say mindful and metacognitively aware, and I've still had certain persistent bad mental habits. I would still get caught in certain loops, and only when I, one, identified those loops, and two, identified the sort of cognitive reappraisal, the psychotechnology, the way that I'm going to habitually reframe this in the future, did that part of the cycle end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think we could sort of view it as a pyramid or something, where you've got these big blocks that are like the awareness and the metacognitive level, getting in touch with yourself, and then sort of moving upward to these smaller, more targeted, more conceptual solutions. I feel like there's way too much evidence for the positive
Yeah.
effects of these cognitive tools of CBT and cognitive reappraisal, and that like healthy, happy, fulfilled people are doing these things automatically, even if they aren't really
Yeah.
conscious of it, even if they aren't like obsessive psychotecs. This is the kind of mental activity that we observe in really happy people and
Yeah.
like high character, self-actualized people. And
I agree.
so um I think, yeah, if we think about it as that pyramid, maybe that reconciles both of our views a little bit.
It does a bit, and it makes me think of how we can kind of get a sense for when and for whom these approaches are valuable. I think if one is finding that And this has been me, right? They're doing a lot of this top of the pyramid stuff. And it just kind of keeps kind of in unpredictable ways. And this might just getting totally undermined and disappearing. And you find you're unable to even do that sometimes. I think then it might be like something's missing at that bottom layer, right? There are these things coming up from within you that you're not in touch with, that you need to get in touch with, that are undermining this, or or sort of you're susceptible to consciousness, and then you, without that, with unconsciousness, you kind of lose the capacity to really utilize these tools. So I think for me, it might be the case that I'm personally gaining a lot more, and I actually use this metaphor in a previous conversation. I'm gaining it a lot more from like fixing the leaks in my boat than from like building, upgrading my rudder and kind of setting newer and getting my rowman to row faster and setting new ambitious destinations. Like, okay, well, that stuff's it is all really good, and I'm not questioning the value of CBT at all. I find that I spontaneously, automatically, easily do CBT type stuff if I put in this other work, and so I'm focusing on putting in that other work because that's, for me, it's almost more of a direct path. I get myself to a state of health and well-being where my boat's not sinking, where suddenly I've got the bandwidth, the capacity, the sense of safety. It's like, oh great, now I'm gonna row a bit faster. Now I'm gonna see where I want to go next. So it might be the case that the question one asks themselves, or the question you ask about someone, is how much of a barrier do they have to being able to utilize things like thought triggers or thought substitutions, or kind of, taking like psychotectural goals and intentions and psychotechnology into situations and using those to flip their perspective around or change their state or whatever. Yeah, I find that I just do that. That's totally that's the how of how I live out what I want to live. I just find that I'm spontaneously motivated to do that, and it's easy to do that if I focus my efforts instead on building those foundations and connecting with myself.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think one, there are different explanations for a potential like differences in experiences on that. One theory is that I just am not doing like mindfulness properly, and I'm just not good at it, and so I'm not getting that much benefit from it when I've done it. I think the more likely explanation is that I've always been an unusually metacognitively, not just
That
aware,
was
but,
my take.
but fascinated,
Yeah.
person. From a really young age, I was obsessed with what was going on in my own mind. And so, yeah, this is sort of like where I've landed. I'm not certain of it, but
I've got a question
yeah,
about
yeah.
that, just to flesh that out. You don't have to answer in detail, but have you spent much of your life or childhood living in fear? Personally, I have experienced that. So I think that might be a difference as well. I think it might be the case that there's less of these underwells and undercurrents of fear that sabotage your capacity to be mindful and cognitive, that you need to sort of give your attention to handle before you can do metacognition. So you're getting a much more joy out of just doing what you're already capable of.
Yeah, well, and it goes to the scarcity thing we've talked about too. Like
Mm.
I think in an ideal world, a lot of the psychotectural teachings that I write about in my books wouldn't be that necessary, because humans would have so many of their physical and psychological needs met that maybe they would by default sort of automatically engage in these processes at least a lot more than they do today. I mean, if I look at my upbringing, like, yeah, one I had, I think, just probably a genetic interest in this stuff. Two, I had, loving parents who, yeah, I mean, raised me in a life without scarcity and living in fear, like you said. Even, the last episode you talked with Robin about like Montessori school. I went to a Montessori school. Like I had a lot of advantages to set me up for the stuff that I write about and to be in a position to write about them. And so, um, yeah, I think probably you've swayed my perspective a bit on this call as well, in the direction of, more people needing to be prescribed some of these lower pyramid bulk uh, psychotectural tools. over the more targeted, strategic, cognitive ones that I often write more about. That being said, I feel like there's already way more talk about this stuff being written. Like there's so much
Totally.
more mindfulness based stuff out there than the more CBT based cognitive changes. I
I
feel like in
agree.
some ways it's lower hanging fruit, and it's more interesting to me again because for me it has created more observable positive change. So
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
yeah,
don't switch your focus. Don't switch your focus. I mean, you you the stuff you try to create. I mean, we already know that it's added a lot of value to our community and that, but also that you're positioned to add the most value about that toolkit because that's the toolkit you're always exploring that you've sort of made work for yourself and that and I don't I also sort of one thing that's come up is I don't want to say that it's impossible for people who are missing some stuff's going on at the lower level of these pyramids to get
yeah.
benefits from these tools.
Oh yeah.
I just think that there's a limit maybe. There's that to solve one part of a problem, there needs to be awareness as well. But that can include, I think, using these tools in a relational context where someone has empathy and care for you, right? Through like a therapeutic or a coaching context or something like that. I think that can be part of it. Yeah, I think both tools can do a lot in probably any context. I suppose what I would just encourage, um, what I encourage people is maybe maybe you are working really really hard to try to be somebody to and try to improve yourself, but there's these pieces of you that are afraid and broken, and that's why that's not working. And shift to listening, shift to curiosity, shift to getting in touch with that, and you might get there might be this well of growth and these kind of new discoveries of what you want your goals to be. Now that's been my journey, and it's taking me to a new place I wasn't able to get with just things like CBT alone. Yeah, but you're right. They're both conversations that are happening at the moment, and that just speaks to that they're both needs, and that we're trying to meet these needs for each other because we're good. We're good people.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree with all that.
That might be a good place to end our call.
I think it might.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Frank.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Mindform Podcast. I'm Ryan A. Bush, founder and author of Designing the Mind and creator of Mindform. Mindform is an exclusive community and training platform for sculpting your psychological software. Members get access to a group of like-minded psychitects, including all of our guests on this podcast, gamified growth tools, events and retreats, and a collection of transformative programs for mental health and self-mastery. You can learn more and apply to join at mindform.io/podcast. I hope to see you inside.